Osiris.
We're mass communicating. Mass communicating. Mass communicating.
Welcome back to Touchdowns All Day. I am your host, Max Dawson, taking you through the past, present, and future of the Disco Biscuits. In this episode, we have something very exciting to share with you. It is an interview with one of the Biscuits' oldest friends, closest collaborators, projects musical and otherwise, and the man who lends his name to one of the Biscuits' most iconic songs, Andy Bernstein. Since the mid-1990s, Andy has been intimately connected to so many aspects of the world of jam bands and jam band culture. First as the editor and author of The Farmer's Almanac, one of the first books dedicated to fish and its scene. Then later as the co-founder with Mark Bernstein of Headcount, a voter registration organization that has grown to become one of the most important forces in getting young people and first-time voters to register to vote. And now as the president of the Divided Sky Foundation, the nonprofit organization established by Trey Anastasio of Fish, dedicated to addiction recovery. Andy, welcome to Touchdowns All Day.
Thank you, Max. A pleasure.
So I figured we'd work backwards today, starting with the very exciting projects you're presently involved in before turning to your long history with the Biscuits and Mark in particular. Now, you just returned from Albany and you were attending the benefit shows that Fish just performed in support of the Divided Sky Foundation. You were not just attending as a fan, although you were also attending in that capacity. Tell us about your role with Divided Sky.
Sure thing, Max. Well, it's been an interesting kind of full circle to a very long journey. I do want to say, though, I'm very excited to talk about the Biscuits. I won't, I'll try not to be long-winded about Divided Sky, but in March of this year, I was asked to be the president of the board of directors of Trey Anastasia's Divided Sky Foundation, which is a recovery foundation. This followed me stepping back as executive director of Headcount, which is an organization that Mark and I started in 2004. And so I had some time on my hands, and it was just perfect timing. For anyone who doesn't know, Trey, who's in recovery, started a foundation announced it in 2020 with the goal of building a recovery center in Vermont, which was very underserved. And it opened kind of quietly in November of last year. And then in March, I was asked to play this role and kind of see it through the next phase. And it's been just an incredible ride. For one thing, Divided Sky, it does something incredibly important. And we all know that addiction is a very, very large problem in this country and the world. But Divided Sky does it very differently. Like Divided Sky is more about kind of building the tools, the psychological tools to thrive in recovery. It's not about getting drugs out of your body. That's what a detox facility does. Divided Sky is more of an educational environment, and to really understand what they're doing is just so inspiring because I'm meeting people who go through the program. Many of them are fish fans. Many of them are not fish fans. And they're like, I talked to a guy the other day who'd been to nine different residential recoveries throughout his life. And this was the one he was like, this is it. This is what works for me. So it's been really incredible. And we did these benefit shows in Albany, and I'm a very lucky guy. My collaborators in my career have been Mark Bernstein, Bob Weir, and Trey Anastasia. I don't really know how this happened, but I've been very blessed to work with my favorite musicians and build things that are positive for our community and the world. And Divided Sky has been particularly satisfying because I'm getting to really use what I've learned over 20 years. Headcount, we were kind of making it up as we went along and figuring things out. And by the time I got to Divided Sky, there were a lot of methodologies that could be applied. And kind of with Headcount, I remember Mark and I used to talk a lot about everything that we learned from grassroots marketing in the jam band scene, him marketing the Biscuits, myself, the Farmer's Almanac, a book about fish that myself and some friends self-published. And then when we started Headcount in 2004, we just started applying all these things that we knew how to do from the early years of the Biscuits and the Farmer's Almanac of the 90s. So these things keep coming full circle. This benefit show, I for the last 6 weeks or so, we're kind of working on it all day, every day to just get all the pieces together. The fish show is the fish show. They don't need us to put on a fish show, but we did a lot behind the scenes with, like, one of the things we did that was very cool is we gave away 300 tickets to people who work in recovery. We called them gratitude tickets. And then we had like a meetup before each show, like our kind of professional networking, just community building meetup. And things like that. I just love things like that. I love how you kind of take this gift, which was a fish show. I mean, it was a trip just to even like have that kind of, I have this unlimited guest list for a fish concert. I mean, it's like, and used it very responsibly. But it was very cool. I'm very grateful to Trey. I'm very grateful to everybody in that orbit who've really put a lot of trust in me. And this is just like this weird, crazy life I have where I get to do these pretty awesome things tied to music, tied to community, tied to philanthropy. And I don't know how I got to do all this because I'm pretty much just a guy who likes to go to jam band shows and like never figured out how to do anything else. I don't know.
The theme that's going to run through this conversation and that runs through your life is turning your passion into participation and picking up lessons in perhaps unexpected environments. You mentioned, you hustling on the lot, handing out farmers' almanacs, Mark giving out flyers in front of fish shows or outside of wetlands. You took those experiences, you've scaled them up and brought them into contexts where the logical mind would say it would never work, but you've proved that some of the grassroots marketing and community building methods that emerged from the jam band community in the 90s can actually have global implications and applications. I think that's the Andy Bernstein story, if I was pitching the biopic.
One thing I'd say about the Biscuit story is that there were a lot of people right around in the inner circle of the Biscuits, as you know, who are far more accomplished than I'll ever be. And this has been going on for the entire time of the Biscuits. For a lot of people who don't know the Biscuits, they have one perception of the band and the community. And what's actually happening is that some of the smartest and most successful people, not just in the music scene, but in like tech and all these things, it starts with the Biscuits. And in some ways, the same is true for fish in that a lot of people who started out kind of in the fish scene are like running the music business, like the biggest promoters and whatnot. So many of them are fish fans and they're putting on, every other kind of music, but their first love is fish or the jam scene. So, I've been lucky to kind of have a front row seat of a lot of that and carve out my own niche more in the nonprofit space. But I think it's like, I'm not the only one. And I think it's not a coincidence. And I think the Biscuits in particular, there's, our band is a band that started at an Ivy League school. And if you know them personally, they're brilliant guys. And John is so brilliant that it's like almost awkward.
Almost?
And So we're all just trying to figure out our little hustle with what's been handed to us and this incredible network that we have.
I've always said the Biscuits are sort of the meta jam band. They are the jam band that studied jam bands that came before them and expanded upon, whether musically with the introduction of all of the different set list and compositional innovations like inversions and dyslexic versions of songs, to the scene itself and the way in which Mark, for example, acts as an ambassador for the Biscuits and jam band culture in general. So many of the lessons from the Dead, from Fish, and the bands that came before the Biscuits, small and large, the Moes, the Max Creeks, the regional bands that the Biscuits came up opening for. I feel like the four guys and five, including Alan, hoovered up so much information and so many influences and built this sort of Voltron or Frankenstein's monster of jam band culture. And it has so clearly had such a lasting influence, not just on the scene, but through the greater participation of people like yourself on music, culture, and politics. And these are some of the things we're going to get into. But I assured you before you came on that we wouldn't go too deep down the path of talking about your work at Divided Sky. And before that head count, I want to direct all of our listeners to your amazing, very lengthy discussion with Josh Rosenberg on the Roadcase podcast. We'll post a link to that in the show notes because it is an incredibly in-depth discussion of your nonprofit work, of everything you've got going on at Divided Sky and everything you have done at Headcount. You and Mark co-founded Headcount in 2004, have registered more than 1 million voters. 1 million voters in that time.
1.5 million at this
1.5.
point. Yeah.
You guys got to update the website. But what I want to know is when you started out with Headcount, you were working primarily with artists in the jam band scene. The Dead, Bobby, Fish, and of course, Bernstein, leveraging his connections. But now you work with Ariana Grande, Beyonce, Harry Styles, the biggest artists in the business. How did Headcount make that transition over the course of your 20-year tenure?
Well, some of it was gradual, and some of it was kind of beyond what I ever expected. But when we started and we were taking it seriously, and especially around 2008 when we were trying to kind of build this thing to last, for me, a lot of the model was Bonnaroo. When Bonnaroo started, if you look at the lineup of the first Bonnaroo, it is Mick Jam Band. It is might as well be Gathering of the Vibes. It was Trey Band as the headliner. It was Robert Randolph was like a big centerpiece of the festival. Biscuits played. The first band to play was escaped my name, a band from Minnesota.
Big Woo?
Big Woo. That's it. Thank you. That would have bothered me. And pretty quickly, what the Superfly guys did, the founders of Bonnaroo, is they morphed it to be more eclectic, but still with a lot of soul and a lot of curation. And so, and they would never in a million years use the word jam band. They would never, they leaned out of that, not into it. And when Headcount was growing in the early years, to me, I said all the time, that's the model we're trying to follow. And so we started working our way out, like indie rock bands. It started with more like the college rock bands, OAR. I mean, Dave Matthews was a key supporter from day one. And we OAR, but then Pearl Jam called us. And John Mayer called us in 2008. And we actually had people on their tour bus, embedded, traveling around. That was sort of the course we were on, but there were a couple really seminal moments for Headcount. And one of the most important moments of the now 21 years was actually the Parkland shooting and the March for Our Lives movement that came out of it. And about a week after it, I got an email from a guy named Jeff Caskey, who was the lawyer for Jam Cruise. So he knew headcount. And he goes, you need to see what my son is doing. And it's going to be all about voting. You need to get involved in this. His son was a guy named Cameron Caskey. And who was became one of the very prominent March for Our Lives students. And they built this remarkable movement, this incredible event in DC. And some of it was jam band adjacent. Like they came out to Dead and Company, and they got to meet with Bobby and John Mayer. And it was very emotional. And because this was, not long after that horrific event. But for headcount, that was a really big kind of point of change, because one thing, we ended up getting involved in running all the voter registration for the March for Our Lives movement all across the country. Like we did 20 events. I think we did a really good job of it. We just brought our A game. And that led to the relationship with Ariana Grande, because at the time her manager was a guy named Scooter Braun, who was basically the force behind the March for Our Lives event and getting production and money and celebrities and all that. So that brought us to Ariana Grande, and we really nailed that. Headcount did a really good job, and our team really the artwork and the organizing of it, and so I think that was the moment where we proved that we could hang in the pop world. It was also the moment where I realized I couldn't hang, because I didn't know a single Ariana Grande song. I wasn't really that interested in knowing an Ariana Grande song. So, and then as we picked up Billie Eilish and all these others, and this year it was Sabrina Carpenter and all these great acts that are very influential, over those years, I started to recognize, okay, there is a getting off point for me. I would say I'm not qualified to run a pop music organization, and I am not.
Yes.
For me, and that was that's doing Divided Sky, going from being executive director to headcount and getting back to my roots, getting back to Fish, becoming a collaborator with Trey, it is a dream come true. I'm not going to soft soap it. It's the coolest thing ever. He is exactly the person you think he is, but it's now I get to really have exchanges of ideas with him, and that's just really, really dope. Weird choice of words, but so yeah, headcount, we were able to do that, but headcount started with Mark and I. In 2004, the band was really inactive. It was one of the many inactive periods for the Biscuits, and it's also when Zach was born. And so Mark was home, and he and I were figuring this thing out together. And one of the very cool things I loved about the beginning was we had all these team leaders, and headcount still has that model where we have organizers in every city. And there's usually about 100 across the country. Well, in that first year, all the team leaders, the part of their assignment was to call Mark and just tell Mark kind of what was going on. And about half of them were Biscuit fans. At this point, the headcount volunteer base Biscuit fans are not particularly highly represented. But at the beginning, it was probably about 50%. And if you really got involved with headcount, you got to know Mark. Yes. And that was I think that's a hidden part of the story. Our story's been told in many ways, but it was smart organizing. It was a unique way to kind of get at the grassroots core of what we had before us and leverage, the power of community. I was going to say the word fandom, but as you know, when you're a Biscuit fan, you're not a fan like a consumer. And if you're a really big fan, chances are you're going to have contact with the band at some point, or people who are creatively touching the band. And so I think we leveraged that a little bit for headcount, that kind of thinking, and Mark's incredible accessibility and his honestly desire to be accessible and to communicate with people. And that's what makes him tick. And it's what made headcount tick in the early years. And, we had no idea it would last for 21 years and still going strong. We had no idea we'd register 1.5 million voters. But one thing that we did have an idea about was that it would actually be really good for the Biscuits, because one of the things that we really wanted to do was build relationships for the Biscuits with folks that maybe didn't really understand what the Biscuits were about. I mean, our initial board, the board that we started with, was Nadia Pressure from Madison House, String Cheese's management company, Rich Goodstone from Superfly of Bonnaroo, and Bob Weir, who was brought to us by Al Schneer, from Mo, who Mark reached out to. So it was like we extended the circle beyond the circle, and that was pretty intentional. It was mostly done because it's what headcount needed, but it was not lost on us that this brought a dimension to Mark, and Mark as a sort of music industry person, which he is today, and that came about in 2004. And that was important because if you know Bernstein, as you do, and probably a lot of our listeners do, Mark's personality is a driving force in so many things. And it's a very, it's fun to listen to Mark be Mark, So that element was something that we were building into the DNA of headcount, but also we were building into the DNA of the Biscuits, because now for the first time, there were a large number of people who had a perception of the Biscuits that wasn't just their original perception, but, oh, they're a philanthropic band. Oh, they actually care about the world. Oh, there's really smart people around them and in the band. So that was one of the many things that we kind of, some of these things we actually thought about. They didn't just happen on their own. Yeah. And there were a lot of things like that, especially in the early years of the Biscuits. At this point, the Biscuits have a great manager, and they're a much bigger thing than they were 20 years ago. But in my early years of the Biscuits, Mark and I would talk every day almost about the Biscuits. And it was really fun because it was a plan of attack. And from the very early period, I think there was a belief by the band and their friends that they were going to be a very successful band, that they were good enough, that the music was really creative. And we had to figure out how we make this thing successful. And we were all in it together. So I kind of had that role in the early years of being Mark's, collaborator, the bouncing ideas and trying to figure all kinds of things out. And that was, I look back at that very fondly, to have that experience, in the formative years and watching it all grow and come together. It was very cool for the Biscuits. Headcount too, but I've been doing that for the Biscuits since '96, really.
In that Roadcase interview, you discussed how the model of participation that the Biscuits exemplify, and that has really always existed in the jam band community, or at least as long as I've been a member of it since the mid 90s, has in recent years started to cross over into other types of fandoms. And for me personally, I'm sure for you and many others, it's been really fun to see Taylor Swift and the Eras Tour awaken the world to the concept of touring with your favorite artist, or creating your own art and merchandise, or a kind of barter economy that takes place outside of the shows, or even taking collective action on social or political issues with other fans. And so I wanted to put this into historical perspective, because you were there at the birth of this, of jam band culture as we now know it in the early and mid 90s. And you actually played a huge role in formalizing it through your work, first on the Farmer's Almanac, later with the Biscuits, Headcount. You've seen these different phases and evolutions. So I wanted to kind of turn the clock back to when you first became involved in this world. But to do that, we really have to go even further back. Before your first Fish show in 1993, before the Biscuits become a thing, we got to go back to Brooklyn. Mark Brownstein, famously a proud Brooklyn native. What was your history with Mark back in your respective Brooklyn days?
So I went to high school, a public high school in Brooklyn called John Dewey High School. And one of my friends was a guy named Keith Kozlov. And Keith's best friend was Mark from a summer bungalow colony, a place called Scroon Lake. And they also had a friend that they grew up with named Larry Chasnoff. And I actually was friends with Larry Chasnoff totally separately. I'd known Larry since I was a little kid, and we really became friends on a summer job. And so Mark I met when in high school, when like Keith had a party and all the kids from his high school showed up. And then there was one kid that we didn't know. It was like, who's this dude? And he went to Poly Prep, which was the fancy school in Brooklyn. And he was the preppy. He was the preppy kid. The Brooklyn kids are like, who brought the preppy? And
are we talking popped collar? We talking like a cable knit sweater over his shoulders?
Not collar, not popped collar. But I do remember the first time I met him. I'm pretty sure he was wearing a collared shirt.
Okay.
Anyway, so I met Mark and I knew Mark and hung out a little bit. But really, what happened was, Mark and I really became tight because of the shared love of the music, and honestly because what we were both trying to do. And this is in 1995. I went to Fish. I went to Sugar Bush in 1995 with Mark, we were really more there together because of our mutual friends. But he and I bonded in a way that we just honestly had. I mean, we knew each other pretty well. We were friends, but we weren't like tight until he started talking about this band that he was in. And I started talking about this idea for a book that I had about fish. And we spend the whole weekend just realizing, wow, we have a lot in common. Like we realize, and I remember very much feeling like I was starting to discover my own identity at that point, like my love of the music and certain things associated with the music and my humor. And it was like, I realized actually from that hang with Mark and a couple other people I met in that era, I was like, I found my people. And my people like to listen to improvisational music with certain enhancements. And we also make a lot of jokes, and most of us are Jewish. That all came together for me that weekend. But it also, what came together is that Mark and I both had these like pretty big dreams of having an impact in this. I mean, we're at Sugar Bush, which, you have to be of a certain era to have seen Fish at Sugar Bush. But imagine 10,000 Fish fans, like literally on a ski mountain in Vermont. And those shows were so special and so surreal, and they inspired. And Mark and I spend all this time talking about a book and talking about his band. I spent also a lot of that weekend with my friend from college, Lockhart Steele, who became my co-author on the Farmer's Almanac. And eventually I brought it to a couple other friends, including Larry Chasnoff, and we put this together. And for those who don't know, the Farmer's Almanac is a book about fish. It's like a fan's guide to fish with set lists and funny stories, and also eventually stuff about other jam bands. And but at that time, we didn't even have a name for jam bands. It was just starting out. And as you said before, I think what the Biscuits were the first band that was inspired by other jam bands. Like the example, I don't know about musically inspired, but certainly inspired by the success and the national touring. So the Biscuits looked up to Mo. There was no doubt. And, as they should have, like Mo had a major label deal actually at that point.
Yeah.
And so there was this vision of, hey, I'm going to I want to have a band too. And I have a band. And Mark was telling me about his band. They might have still been Zexy then, or they had just changed the name to Disco Biscuits. But at one point, I think like somebody comes up to him in the parking lot and recognizes him, and I was pretty impressed. And he was telling me all about it, and it just sounded great. And then I didn't go to a show until I just looked it up. It was 4/18/96. Mo was headlining Penn Rocks. They were at UPenn playing the big like spring fling at Penn, and then the Biscuits played that night at a fraternity.
Get ready for a band whose name has been permanently imprinted in every WDR DJ's mind. We thought this name of the band was the most original name of a band that we've ever heard before. The Disco Biscuits!
That was my first show. I just looked up the set list, and the set list is definitely inaccurate because the set list does not have Bernstein and Chasnoff. And they did debut Bernstein and Chasnoff that night at our request. I was there with Larry Chasnoff. I did see the set list had a Mr. Don in it, and I remember hearing Mr. Don for the first time. Mr. Don is a great song. You know, it's just great. And it was that great in 1996. And it was like, wow, Mark's friend on the guitar is like making these amazing sounds that are as exciting to hear as any other band, including that one that was at Sugarbush. Remember, Max, like the very first time I saw them play, I was like, oh my God, Mark's band is really good. and never stopped thinking that.
Growing up in New York in the late 80s, what kind of music were you seeing? I know Wetlands opened its doors in 1989. Were you part of that early Wetlands scene?
Not the very beginning. So when I was in high school, I graduated high school in 1989. When I was in high school, I listened to classic rock. I listened to The Who. I listened to the Beatles, Led Zeppelin. I'm just starting to wake up to the Dead, but that more came with college and other things. And going on a road trip, like I went on basically on Dead Tour in 91, mostly just to get from New York to California, but the Grateful Dead were kind of following us. So, you know, all those coming of age things, but Grateful Dead, Mind Expanding Things, then Fish, like hit me like, you know, either my first headline Fish show in 1993 in Providence was, you know, it really was life-changing. And I knew it was life-changing. I knew it was life-changing as I sat there. And then 3 years later, the Biscuits, and the Biscuits, it was more of a build up to the point where they musically were, as I said, they were great from the first time I saw them, but there were dimensions that they had not yet discovered, for sure. And in those early years, getting to see each and every step of that, both musically or popularity or building up a touring apparatus, I mean, it was so freaking cool, man, to start watching that all happen. And I mean, I treasure those memories of, you know, all the first Camp Biscos and the first New Year's and the hot air balloon, but also just like the first tours, really. It took a while to get there. You can't just go on tour the day you have a band. You have to work your way toward it. And getting to see all of that, I just have so many memories. I really an unlimited amount of crazy stories from that era.
When you headed off to college, you landed at what would ultimately be my alma mater, Brown University. And Brown is well known as a place that nurtures free thinkers and weirdos like you and me. But it's also surprisingly been an incubator for people who became actively involved in jam band culture. So in the mid-90s alone, You were at Brown. Amir Bar-Lev, the director of the multi-part Grateful Dead documentary series. John Richter at Nugs. It was the home of NetSpace, which was the tech platform that powered Fishnet and many of the early email discussion lists, including Discuss Biscuits, where people were having their first forays onto online communities dedicated to jam band music. And one thing that I found really interesting and kind of doing my research for this episode, and obviously in talking to you, is one thing that a lot of these Brown jam band people have in common is we all had the same strange major that you can never explain to your parents' friends or people in a job interview: modern culture and media. So I am at MCM 1999. You're MCM 1994. I'm wondering, is there something in that curriculum or in the water in Providence that makes you want to not only chase bands around the country, but also to like not just be a bystander or, as you were saying, a consumer, but an active participant and a collaborator and someone who creates their own way in conjunction with improvisational music, art, and culture?
No. If Brown had a deadhead culture, I missed it. I was not, and if there were Fish fans at Brown, that I mean, Lockhart Steele, who was 2 years younger than I am, that's where I kind of found Fish culture, and that was like a whole. I mean, Locke is an amazing person who ended up accomplishing incredible things in life. Started Curbed and Eater, those two big websites, and he and I did the Farmers Almanac together, and we came together. I remember I was in the student newspaper and I overheard him talking about Fish. I was like, Fish, you know Fish? And it turned out he had a lot of tapes. But I didn't know you were a modern culture media major. I have no idea what it was, Max. If you can explain what it was, can you write it down? Because somebody asked me this like yesterday, and I'm like, I couldn't explain to you what my major was. I'm really majored in hockey. I was the radio announcer for the hockey team, and that I really enjoyed. And I wanted to work in hockey. And when I started out professionally, I worked covering, I was a reporter covering the business side of sports. That's the job I found for myself. I did that for 10 years. And when Headcount started, that's what I was doing. When I remember, and it was cool. Like I was one of the first of my friends to have a decent job. And I remember in 1999, I took a vacation, paid vacation because I had a real job, and I went with the Biscuits in their van in Idaho. I flew out to Idaho, to Boise, and they said at this point John Lesser was their only crew. Yes. There was no lighting. It was just one guy, and they said, "Will you help us lug our equipment?" And I said, "No, I'm on vacation. I don't want to lug your fucking equipment, but I'll take you all skiing." I just like threw money at the problem. I was like, I'll be a Mac Daddy. I'm taking everybody skiing.
Buy your way out of the problem.
And we went from Idaho to Salt Lake City to Boulder to Fort Collins to Aurora. And that was one of the most incredible like life experience shows. And I could talk about that experience for an hour if I could. Like it was something.
That was a special season in all of our lives. I had a similar experience, not in the van, but I was in my senior year in Brown that semester. And I don't think I had been out to the West Coast. Maybe I had been out once before to visit a relative. And we got it in our head that we would fly out and surprise the band when they were playing in Arizona and Las Vegas and LA. So me and a couple of other friends from Brown who were hardcore Biscuits heads flew out. And once we arrived, suddenly they had a guaranteed crowd of at least 3 people at each one of those shows. And so we traveled together. We spent their off days together. We all hung out in the single hotel room that they had together. We were all as broke as one another. We were all trying to cobble together food or going to a gas station to get our one meal for the day, and then hitting the road the next day and driving up the road to the next show. And I don't know if you had the same experience that I did, but we started out in Arizona, 2 nights in Arizona, then Vegas and LA. By the time we hit LA, we had picked up 1 or 2 or 3 people at each stop along the way. There would be someone who the band just connected with and who saw what was going on and wanted to be a part of it and had no intention of taking a day off or skipping class the next day and going 4 or 5, 6 hours to the next show, but who was so moved by the music that was being performed and by the tight-knit, really welcoming scene that was around the band. And so we snowballed. And by the time we hit LA, there were 12, 15 of us as opposed to the 3 or 4 of us that started out.
And what you're describing is so core to what the Biscuits are about and how it all happened. And we also know that it's still happening. But I remember the progression of this. It started with by 90, even by 96, the Biscuits had a big fan named Dave Dreadlocks. And Dave Dreadlocks traveled with the Biscuits. And one time I was trying to talk Mark up to a girl, and she thought the Farmer's Almanac was super cool. And I said to her, "You think the Farmer's Almanac is cool? This guy has a dude with dreadlocks following him around." And that was, tour head number 1. And I remember then in probably 98, I went up to Burlington with Chasnoff, and we saw the Biscuits maybe open for Strange Folk at the front. Okay. And there were these 2 dudes who were taper dudes who were traveling on their own. And it was wow, they were oh my God, the Biscuits have traveling tapers. And then I kind of got a little vibe of who they were. And these guys were just like us. And their names were John Lesser and Mark Fundos. And they were some of the first traveling fans who had a tape rig and didn't have dreadlocks. Mm-hmm. And of course, John Lesser ended up becoming their sound guy and their first touring guy. Mark Fundos was somebody who smartly only barely ever worked for the band and started a whole great career. But Mark was the tour manager for a minute because they just needed him to be. So that was an example. So what you're describing here, where people would show up as fans, and very quickly they were friends, and very quickly this community was building, and there are some people who are still around. I mean, I don't remember what year Carla Doe hopped on, but it was around then, certainly before '99. And Carla and I are still good friends, and Carla still comes to shows. Trooper, who went to school with them, was the very first true Biscuits fan, really from day one. And but what you're describing, that whole show up for the music, actually connect with the band members, connect with the community, build community. This stuff was happening, particularly in the 90s, at this frenetic pace. And what's really cool is a lot of the people who were part of that are probably listening to this and probably and you probably talk to all the time. I mean, especially for 99, there's still a lot of us still around. 25 years. I mean, that's not nothing. Yeah. But that trip in 99, what I remember was we go to Idaho, maybe 40 people there. Which wasn't bad. That had a good scene. Then we drive to Salt Lake. They were playing a place called the Ritz. And we pull into the parking lot. And, they have their little piece of paper, before internet, before cell phones, anything, of where they're going. And then there's a silence as we pull into the parking lot. And Magner goes, "It's a fucking bowling alley?" They were playing a bowling alley, and there was like nobody there. It was Lester's college girlfriend was there, and I was there, and less than 10 people. Well, let me tell you, the Biscuits rocked that show. They rock, and you saw too in those shows that it didn't matter how many people were there. They took whatever energy was in that room and they turned it up 50. And like I remember they played this killer I Man, and then we go through a snowstorm to get to Boulder. And oh my God, in that van in the snowstorm, I mean, we really shouldn't have been driving. It was insane. And we get to Boulder, and again, like they had a little piece of paper of where they were going. We couldn't find it. It's like a family friend of Magner's was going to put us up. Like the band, like as you were saying before, like you're trying to not spend money on hotels. We're trying not to spend money whenever we don't have to. They were sleeping on floors. They were like doing all of that. The Biscuits were opening for Mo at the Fox. And
yes,
Mo was the king of the jam bands. In fact, in the Farmer's Almanac, in the section that we had in the Farmer's Almanac called From the Bottom, which was about jam bands, and that we kind of like snuck the Biscuits in there. We like created that section basically to promote the Biscuits, and we wrote their little bio and had the bio of 9 other jam bands that all were bigger than the Biscuits at the time we first did it in 1996. Yeah. And Mo was like the number one. You know, Mo was the thing to aspire to. And at the time, Mo were so big that they had their own RV. No band travels in an RV anymore. But like they had an RV. Wow. And they were headlining the Fox, and it was sold out. Well, we get to the Fox, and there were Biscuit fans at the Fox. Like the Biscuits opening for Mo that night was a big deal. And there were these two guys who had a little sign, and they were brothers or something. They looked like the Hanson brothers. And one of the signs said, drove all the way from Minnesota for Biscuits tour, need 1 ticket. And every Mo fan and Biscuit fan walked by those two guys. And it just like kind of set a tone, set a vibe. It's like, the Biscuits are here. That's a big deal too. And those guys did get in. Yeah. And the Biscuits play a great like opening set. And then the next night is Fort Collins, the Starlight, I believe.
Oof. Yes.
And man, they crushed it. Like that, I'm probably 150 people in the room, but a room with 150 people can rock. Like when you filled a room, and it might have been 250, it felt like huge. And there were like girls backstage, very, very innocent, but actual females backstage. And it was just like, my friends are rock stars. Like, that's how I felt with 150 people. And they absolutely, I mean, because those nights, I mean, these are the formative nights. These are the nights where they're just crushing a room in Colorado, crushing it. And then the next night is Quixote's in Aurora. And that was an even smaller club. And they packed that club. I even lugged their shit that night because I was just so grateful for the incredible week that I'd had. So that was March of 99. And then they come home. You know, they were still, you know, Salt Lake, they were playing to almost nobody. Well, they come home to the Troc for $9.99. And I'm pretty sure they sold out the Troc that night in Philadelphia. And the Troc holds like maybe 600, but the Troc has like double balconies. The Troc feels palatial. And they filled it. They filled the Trocadero. And they put on what still is, to me, like the most classic Biscuit show is for $9.99. The improvisation they did and the really like composing on stage. I don't know if people listen to For $9.99, but every Biscuit fan should listen to For $9.99. It is arguably the 5877 of Biscuits.
Yes.
You agree, Max, and you know more than I do. So,
fair comparison, certainly.
Yeah. So, that era, and also the band then broke up, which was not the first time. In fact, one of the first times. Now I'm going to go back to 1996. The Farmer's Almanac. Mm-hmm. We put on a post-Fish show after one of Fish's first garden shows. It was, I think it might have been October 30th, which is today. So 28 years ago today, if I have the date right, I might not. We put on a Biscuit show after a Fish show, and it was like the Farmer's Almanac post-Fish party, about 150 people. They were so good that night. They debuted I think Morph that night, and they were so good. I remember they sold out all their tapes. That was the thing. They sold out all their tapes, and the cassette tapes were gone for merch, and then they broke up. They broke up after that show. I don't remember why. There was some sort of fight, and they broke up. And it didn't last very long. But of course, in 99, as I'm sure you remember well, or after New Year's of 99, so the beginning of 2000, Mark was not in the band. And that was something that I also was, like, Mark was living in Brooklyn then, and as was I. So that was something that I really experienced with him. And it's also then when he started writing the Maui Project songs. There are probably Biscuit fans who don't know about the Maui Project, right? Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an underexplored moment in the band's history. Mark went and wrote a rock opera in the winter of 2000 when he was not in the band. And a lot of things were happening in his personal life that were actually really good things. And he'd moved to Brooklyn. He was living with his future wife, and he wrote all these songs that were kind of inspired by that. And the Maui Project was they'd gone to Hawaii together. And so there were all these songs about Hawaii, but there were also songs about the band breaking up, and the songs were great. Yeah, a lot of future Biscuits classics came from Maui Project. And then they went and performed at the Wetlands and sold out the Wetlands.
As you say, I've never been a king, that I'll ever hold the rock, that I'll never hold the ring. But I know that my slap shot is better than that. And you think that you know who I am, that I never played a part in the ultimate scheme with you. Then I wonder if I'm ever gonna come to back. I mean, here's something that maybe not a lot of people know also is the way the Biscuits got their first Wetlands gig
was that Mark was always at Wetlands handing out flyers for the Biscuits for whatever show there was. I was there handing out flyers for the Farmer's Almanac. And eventually, Mark managed to get on the phone with Chris Zahn, who was the booker of the Wetlands. And they had a conversation. And Mark, in the conversation, said, "Our dream is to play the Wetlands." And Chris said, "Well, let's make that dream come true."
What's up, Wetlands? We are the Disco Biscuits. How's everybody? Right behind me is the drummer, Sam. Oh.
Chris Zahn, the booker of the Wetlands, quit being the booker of the Wetlands to manage the Biscuits.
To my left, the young lion of the band, the little wizard of the keys with the black and white ox machine, Arrow and Magna.
I mean, this guy had booked thousands of bands, and there's one that he quit for. And Chris Zahn, picture Chris Zahn is, there's nothing jam band about Chris Zahn.
My name's John. I love this little guitar right here.
He was a New York music guy. He ended up not remaining as the Biscuits manager and like booking the Blue Note for years. He was a New York music guy.
And the man to my right on the vanilla cover bass guitar, the machine with the specter on his hands, Barrett Borowski.
He quit his job, left the Wetlands to go and be the Biscuits manager. The guy who took over for him was Jake Stafrowski, who then set himself on fire at a biscuit show.
And I mean, once they finally got through the front door at Wetlands, they systematically took ownership of the club to the point where not only did they become sort of the signature late stage Wetlands band, but they stole the booking agent. They stole the lighting designer, Matty Urbino, who left Wetlands to go on tour with the Biscuits.
999 was his first show.
The Wetlands became their home.
Yep.
You know, that tour and the culmination with that return to the Troc, I feel very similar to the way you do about that moment where the Biscuits went away one band and came back another. And those of us who had the opportunity, like you, like me, to make it out west and see the midpoint of that process, of that metamorphosis, we had a little bit of a premonition of what was about to happen. But the people whose last Biscuit shows had been, I don't know, maybe in January, State College, or maybe they were the Wrecker Theater later on in January that month, and then didn't see the band until they came back and played that run of shows at the Chameleon Club in Towson and at the Troc. It was the equivalent of seeing a child and then their teenage version, like after they had gone through puberty, like they had a mustache and muscles and their voice had changed. They had fully realized their destiny and become the band that we always knew they could be.
Yeah, I mean, it was exactly that. And like, all of us always believed the Biscuits would be as successful as they were. And you know, all of us also dreamed that they would play the Garden. Like, we dreamed that they'd be the biggest band in the world, because the Biscuits, to me, like the consistency of songs, like I have a lot of Fish bathroom songs. I don't have feel that way with a lot of Biscuit songs. I once asked Mark, kind of in the early years, I said, "So what are your like big songs?" Like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you know, like Antelope, there's Yam, there's Mike's song. Like, what are your big songs? And he looks at me very seriously and goes, "Honestly, we have a few small songs." And one thing about the Biscuits that I say is I have this thing called the sick jam button. Like, the Biscuits, unlike most even jam bands, at any point in any song, they can just hit the sick jam button and it can be the greatest version of any song you've ever heard. It doesn't matter what song it is. That's Fish is just starting to kind of go there. And not with the level, not with the, I mean, you know it. Like, it can happen anytime, at any night, in any biscuit show, that they take you all the way there. And it's, and I don't think there's any other band that can do that.
Certainly. And that winter 99 tour is where that came to be. Because even when they left on that tour, there still were 4-minute versions of Frog Legs, or, Mulberries might be a 7-8 minute song. And on that tour, they discovered that every song could be a Run Like an Antelope. Every song could be a Dark Star, that you didn't need to necessarily differentiate between songs that jammed and songs that didn't jam, and that any song that had a break between lyrical sections that maybe previously would have been a short guitar solo or a piano fill, that was an opportunity and an invitation for the band to explore and to create a space. And so by the end of that tour, you had jammed out Bizarre Escapes, you had jammed out Mulberry Streams. Every one of the songs that had previously been a short, contained, no jam song became a potential jam vehicle, on par with almost anything in their catalog. And of course, bassists will always be bassists and helicopters will always be helicopters. But when you can have a jammed out Frog Legs, suddenly nothing is off the table.
Totally. And the JP8000, when was that? When did that come in? Was that 98?
Halloween 1997.
Okay. Yeah. At the very beginning of tonight, you talked about something about the kind of the Biscuits being the first meta jam band. And that is very, very true. But one of the things that the guys felt really strongly about was they didn't want to be just musically derivative. And John's talked about that They stopped listening to Fish. They stopped listening to all their influences, because they just wanted to find something new. And they were, I remember they played a show in Long Island in a bar, way out in Long Island, that they didn't even advertise. Larry and I, Chasnoff and I, knew there was a show, and we calling the hotline to find out where it was, and the hotline wasn't updated, and we somehow found our way to this show. We figured it out. And there's nobody there. This is 5 people. This is just a few friends. And we're hanging out in the backyard of this place. And Barber is telling Larry Chasnoff how much he just wants to find a new sound. Larry compliments John on Mr. Don. And Larry's singing him the guitar licks of Mr. Don. And John's doing it with him. And it's cool. Larry's repeating his song back to him. But John, probably in the same conversation, says, this isn't enough for me. We want to do something new. We want to do something that nobody's done before. And then, of course, that was Transfusion.
Tell me a little bit about the first time you heard John play and your thoughts about his particular style.
Well, I was telling you before, the first time was going to see them at a fraternity at Penn, and just being wow, this band is for real. One of the things I remember is, as I mentioned, when we were doing the second volume of the Farmer's Almanac, we wanted to promote the Disco Biscuits. So we created a whole section called From the Bottom about up-and-coming Fish-inspired bands, all to sneak our friends the Disco Biscuits in. Writing it and trying to describe the style of music. I asked Larry, how would you describe it? And he's like, well, John is amazing, and basically they all play to set up how amazing he is. And this was the very raw beginnings of the Disco Biscuits. And I think what we even wrote in the almanac was that they were still figuring out what their sound was. They were an amalgam of the different bands they'd heard, but that they were on their way to creating their own sound. And I think the last line was, that's sure to change, like their style still not being really distinct. It's had a nicer way of saying it, but then we said, that's sure to change. See them now and say I saw them when. That was the last line and that little blurb in the almanac, and fuck yeah, we nailed that. So everybody who saw them now can say we saw them when.
Everyone who saw them then now gets to come on this podcast and tell us all about it.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So Mark's songwriting, I want to turn our attention now to the song that bears your and Larry's names, because it's obviously one of the Biscuits' most enduring classics. It's a song that has always had a very special place in my heart, not just because it's association with you, but because I feel like it captures so much about Mark, his sense of humor, the style of his songwriting. But Mark's songwriting has always largely been autobiographical. We talked about the Maui project and how he wrote about his time in Hawaii. Another song that emerged in this period was about his friend Aaron McKeon, Trooper. And of course, there's Bernstein and Chasnoff, which is at least obliquely about his old friends, Andy and Larry.
Bernstein and Chasnoff, where do you get off? Thinking you're only 2 of 20.
There's still a bit of confusion around Bernstein and Chasnoff, despite how many times you or Mark tries to clear up what the song is actually about. People always think it's about either you guys getting sued by fish or, according to Mark, lawyers named Bernstein and Chasnoff suing somebody. Could you clarify once and for all, put to rest, what the meaning behind Bernstein and Chasnoff is?
Yes, it's way more fun than either of those things. And no, we were never sued by fish. And I don't know of any law firms named Bernstein and Chasnoff. What it was about was in the first edition of the Farmer's Almanac, we had a list of contributors. And there were maybe in reality 6 or 7 people who'd contributed to it, but we kind of wanted them. Our vision was in the future there would be hundreds, which eventually there would be. So to get it going, we had a longer list of contributors than actually existed. And some of the names were really absurd and made up, were like names of childhood friends. So there was Harvey Klopstein, not a real person. Alex Cabot, a real person.
Okay.
And Cabot, we just won't have it. We know exactly who you are.
Tariq Ali, somebody I learned about in a John Lennon autobiography. Shep Williams, a pseudonym that I'd used before.
Tariq and Shep Williams, phony names will only go so far. You're getting sued.
These were all made up names, and phony names will get you so far. This is what we've learned.
Yes.
And so that was what the song was about. And the first copy of the Farmer's Almanac was 96 pages, stapled together, very, very DIY. But it did really well. Like, people loved it. So at the time, our friend Keith Kozloff was living in Burlington, and Mark went up to visit Keith, and they had a copy of the Farmer's Almanac, and they're just looking at it and seeing the names of their childhood friends in it, and they just thought it was the funniest thing. And they were just basically making fun of us. So they write a song to make fun of us. And one thing, we have good sense of humor about ourselves. Like Larry and I thought it was the funniest thing in the world. Not too long ago, I kind of pulled back and said, it's like, wow, these lyrics really kind of make fun of us. Like, these are like, why don't you go take a bath? You're so damn hairy. And it had never even occurred to me that this would not reflect positively on me, that I had a song named after me, because I've always loved it. I've always loved when they play it. To have that special thing is just really awesome.
And it's consistent with Mark's general sense of humor and way of expressing affection, which, like many Northeastern Jews of a certain age, we bust each other's balls in order to show the affection we hold for one another. You could say the same thing about Trooper.
She throws anyone lives, as people say. Always on time, it's a police crime for climbing to wait.
There are elements of all of these songs where Mark is poking their subjects in the ribs, but only really to say, you know I love you, right?
And that's always how I took it too. And it's ultimately part of my identity is I have a song named after me. How cool is that?
Any guess of how many shows you may have seen over the last 29 years?
My guess is somewhere around 350, but it is just a guess. I tried to go back on Fantasy Tour once and figure it out. And it's just so many of the same venues and same cities. And who can remember how many times I went to Starlight Ballroom or things like that? But I feel like I've been to most of the shows at the Electric Factory. I'm pretty sure I went to every show at the Wetlands except that first one. And, it adds up over 30 years. You go to 12 shows a year. And even though all the set breaks that the Biscuits took, they still played a lot of shows in the Northeast. And we got lucky in the Northeast that the Biscuits never really stopped taking the big gigs. And also, the Biscuits are very smart business people. And I think they figured stuff out long before a lot of other bands that touring and a tour bus and these things, while it might be the standard model, is not a very good economic model for bands. And so when the Biscuits were not playing a lot of shows for various internal reasons, they never really stopped taking the New York and Philly gigs and things like that. And therefore, someone like me living in the New York area still got to see a lot of shows. And also, even during COVID, let's not forget the Biscuits were probably the most active band in America during COVID. Biscuits, Goose, Pigeons are the three bands that just kept playing. Yeah. And even during the COVID years, I'm still sitting, I probably went to 10, 12 shows a year just doing those drive-ins and things like that. So, yeah, I'm certainly in the 300 club, but I don't know really. I have no idea the exact number.
Well, I know that during that period, you've racked up some very impressive statistics. Starting out with, you are, I believe, the only person who's ever been to every Camp Bisco.
Angelica Magner would disagree.
Okay.
So Angelica also says she's been at every Camp Bisco. I've definitely been at every Camp Bisco. Yes. And Angelica and I and Mark, John, and Aaron are definitely the only ones.
And if I understand correctly, you contributed creative inspiration for one of the big fan favorite events that used to take place on Camp Bisco weekend. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the color war was something that really Mark and I came up with together in a conversation. I think I was saying before, in the early years, I was very much a kind of thought partner to Mark in just how to make Bisco as successful as possible. And one of the things that was standing in the way of that was that Camp Bisco, especially the third one, it was getting really gnarly, with kids ODing. There was no tragic end, but there was people who had to go to the hospital and stuff like that. And we had a conversation about how do we change the vibe? How do we make it about community and love of music and all the best things about Bisco? And in that conversation, it's Camp Bisco. What's the best thing about camp? Fun competition. And we came up with Color War, very intentionally as a vibe changer. And I think it actually really did that. And it elevated the fans who I think have always brought the best element to the scene, their passion, that family element, that creativity. And, once the idea happened, it was really given back to the fans. And I'm pretty sure that was really run by the fans. And I had so much credit to that group of people. I mean, the group of people that I associate with Discuss Biscuits, the original Biscuits, pre-Fantasy Tour, and I was never on that. I was never like totally part of that community, but I know most of them and the ones who are still around. And just like huge shout out to all of you. Like huge shout out for being the best of Bisco and loving the band and loving the community and loving each other. And it's so great now to see a lot of those faces, especially at the show in New York with the for the rock opera this past March, like seeing all the old faces come back. And I know how much the band appreciates them all. Just moment of appreciation for the people who created this community and continue to nurture it. And, like my hats off to all of you, because I've had a kind of a different journey, a different ride. And you all put in so much. And you all created Bisco. The band created the Disco Biscuits, but the fans created Bisco.
Another impressive stat from this period. You attended every New Year's Eve from 1998 through 2006. Do I have that correct?
That is true. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure I had the longest streak of anybody because, the first one was 150 people. So it was a small group, and one by one, the other 149 dropped out. I went to all the first New Year's shows, and more importantly, New Year's shows were great, especially in that era. And I could do a whole podcast with all the memories of each and every one of those. Man, I'll tell you, the Biscuits, early aughts, like Hammerstein, New Year's, those shows felt, man, did we feel like we were on the cusp of something. I mean, that was to go up in the rafters and look at 3,000 people rock into the Biscuits on New Year's, and the ones in Camden, there was 6,000 people. It was, I think the last one I went to was that before the streak ended. With Questlove was DJing in the atrium there of the amphitheater. Lots of great memories that I'll always cherish. And as I said, I never stopped wanting to be there. I never didn't value it. Like a Biscuits New Year's, a Camp Bisco, those were must attend back then. If there's ever another Camp Bisco, I will be there. And one of the reasons, Max, I was excited to do this podcast is I just have so many memories that I'm excited to share because, history gets lost if we don't document it, if we don't repeat it. And there was such a rich history in that era.
One thing that I always have credited people like you and Gay Deal and Kartzman with teaching me is that whether you knew you were teaching me this or not, you did, that if a band plays an amazing show and no one is there to write about it and memorialize it and create the mythology around it, it could very easily just disappear into the ether. And it's true of the Grateful Dead in particular. Authors, the creative people who surrounded the band, who almost from the start began creating the mythology that sustained the band over the course of its career. Obviously, the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, other works of nonfiction from that time period, but even just the legends that existed around particular shows, around, the aforementioned Cornell 77, or, when Marsalis came out and played Eyes of the World. There are those moments that became legendary because of the music itself, but also because of the storytelling that took place around them. And I always felt like, the Almanac, how it did for Fish, we could do for the Biscuits as well. And part of the animating instinct behind this podcast is to continue to tell those stories, to continue to share those experiences and send people back to the music. Hopefully someone will go back and listen to one of the shows you talked about, that Salt Lake City show at the bowling alley, or New Year's Eve 98 with the debut of the hot air balloon. These moments that, musically they stand on their own, but when we tell the story of them, they become something else. They go from events to legends.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned Andy Gadiel, the founder of Jambase, because I think Gadiel has also been a quiet backbone. I think in a lot of ways, Gadiel started Jambase because of how inspired he was by the Biscuits.
Oh, yeah.
like he was a fish guy. And when Gadiel and I became friends in that era as he was discovering the Biscuits, and he loved the Biscuits. And I have a great photo from the crowd at Wetlands, and he's right in front there. And when Gadiel and I first became friends, there was a show at the Webster at Webster that I talked about when the Biscuits came back to Webster Hall. I posted something about the first Webster Hall show. They played a side room that's now a bathroom, and Magner couldn't get his Leslie up the stairs, so he didn't have the Leslie. He basically just had maybe the JP. He had a different sound that night, and they went deep into transfusion that whole show that night, and Gadiel had a tape of that show, and he and I bonded around that show and how much we loved that show, and this would have been I'm forgetting what year, probably 98, but
July 3rd, 1998.
Yeah, so and Jam Bass probably started within the next year of that. So yeah, Gadiel, like me, has never stopped being friends with Mark. He's never stopped loving the Biscuits. And Gadiel was there on the New Year's show, and that first New Year's show. And after that New Year's show, there was a moment where the Biscuits invited the entire crowd back to their house. They lived in Upper Marion or somewhere, and Lower Marion. It was kind of this dingy band house, and they invited the entire crowd back to the house, and probably 40 kids came. I remember Sacred was there, and I gave a toast, and my toast was, I remember it almost word for word. I said, "We're all very lucky to have the Disco Biscuits in our lives. And at some point, each of us," and I said something about how much fun it is, whatever. I said, "But at some point, each and every one of us has realized they're the best band." And it was this just moment. And Gadiel has always repeated this to me. Now we're over 25 years later. He'll just turn to me and go, "The best band."
I love it. It's a memory I'll always cherish. And it, for me, being still relatively new to seeing the band, only having really discovered them 3 months earlier, to find myself, sitting in, were we in John's bedroom or wherever that toast was made? I remember us all piled into a room, people hanging upside down off the bed. Every corner of the house had someone either trying to sleep or, people telling stories and meeting people that you only knew from the internet or reconnecting with old friends. It's a really special memory. And it's something that, those of us who were there, like you, like Andy, like myself, we still feel so much warmth and happiness in sharing that story with others, and of course sharing it with one another as well. So, you've been seeing the band for as long as anyone, perhaps the longest of anyone. And I would love to know, what's your take on the band's current resurgence? Because it's fairly widely accepted that the Disco Biscuits are experiencing a surge in creativity and the quality of their performances and in their popularity that is very rare for a band to encounter on the cusp of its 30th anniversary.
It's just incredible. And I makes me think of Iceland. And after the second night of Iceland, I turned to everybody and said, "That was the best Biscuit show I've ever seen." And they're like, "Oh yeah, that's nice." I'm like, "No, this was the best Biscuit show I've ever seen." And I never, ever say that. I never walk out of a show and say it. And there was a reason, because they played songs in ways they'd never played them. They were making sounds that they'd never made, really just killer electronic sounds that I just instantly recognized as new and better. And playing songs that were 30 years old, or close to it and playing them better than they've ever played them. And then on top of it, you have all the new songs and all the songs that Joey co-wrote, which just crush live. I mean, they're great songs and they're great on the album, but the level that they crush live, like I remember at that Webster Hall show, Deal, which wasn't even the one that had stood out to me, like, holy shit, was that the energy and just the mastery of it. So, you know, we really are in a wonderful period where they're not only have great new songs, but they're playing them better than they ever could play them. And, you know, in some ways similar to Fish, at least in terms of that. Fish, I think also, you know, as they've never stopped, neither of these bands have ever stopped trying to perfect their craft. And whereas the big classic rock bands all got worse as they got older, our bands got better. Our bands had more history and more practice and challenged themselves. And I hope, I hope it never stops. And what Joey has done, I loved at Webster Hall that somebody, I started chanting, Joey, Joey. Nobody listened to my chant, but I could hear behind me, somebody else started a Joey, Joey. And that took on, the whole place started doing it. And that was a wonderful moment because Joey really did, not only did Joey co-wrote the songs, but he got the bands focused. And obviously you've talked about this a lot on the podcast. What Joey did was incredible for this era. But I think back of Hot Air Balloon, when I got to Silk City that night in 98, waiting at the door was Benji Eisen, who had written the program. And, I just feel like the Biscuits have always made room for their friends to be part of this thing. And each and every era had different contributions by different people in different ways. And we're now seeing like a culmination of it and the incredible songs, the incredible creativity, how personal it is for Joey and the band. But Joey has poured himself, every ounce of humanity into this and found a talent he didn't know he had. And, but in a way, it's all like, it's just a series of full circle moments where we all get to keep coming back to the things we love. And for me, doing Divided Sky and after a whole lifetime in the scene, getting to collaborate with Trey and really get to know him and have him kind of understand what makes me tick, which is just so mind-blowing. And for Joey to essentially save the band, we'd still have a band, but it wouldn't be the same without Joey. And, so Joey deserves every accolade. You guys, both of you, the band gets to look out every day at every show at their best friends and see they feed off your love of the music. They respect both of you so much as people, as brains, as just great humans to know. And then when they literally can go on the stage and see you guys give that energy back to them, it reminds me of I remember Clarko and Carla in the boxes at the Hammerstein. They would have the lower box and they would dance so hard. And I knew they were a part of the show. They were feeding the band. And you guys are doing that every night. And it's just and that's Bisco. And that's unique to the Disco Biscuits. There's no other band that has anything similar to this that I'm aware of. All bands have rail riders, but they don't have rail riders of the intellectual and creative contributing capacity of you guys. So I just I've had my wonderful run and my weird little part of the Biscuits history, but I just, I want to take my hat off to every single person who's been part of that. And all of us, man, look at us. It's 2024, to those of us who are still standing and still coming out, we are getting the reward of many years of this symbiotic relationship with our creative captains, the Disco Biscuits, and damn, what a ride it's been.
Well, by way of wrapping up, you mentioned these full circle moments, and I wanted to go back to one of those moments that I heard you talk about on that great Roadcase podcast episode. You talked about being backstage at the Fare Thee Well shows, which is hard to believe were 10 years ago, but that you were looking around and seeing so many of the people we came up with. So Pete Shapiro, obviously, but then the aforementioned Dan Berkowitz, Benji. I don't know if Gay Deal was there, but I'm sure he was in the building somewhere. Mark. For the people in our original group, that time with the Biscuits on the road, 98, 99, even earlier in your case, it wasn't just a phase that we grew out with. It was the formative experience that shaped who we became and was a catalyst for a lifetime of friendship and collaboration that's not only changed our little niche jam band music community, but through the efforts of people like yourself and through the entrepreneurialism of people like Dan and the tech savvy of people like Andy, has come to change pop culture, even politics. And so much of the modern music industry today is built around the lessons learned from jam band culture. As you were talking about the folks at Superfly and Bonnaroo, so many of the things that now are just pop were at one point fringe jam band activities that we participated in, that we were doing, not with any kind of eye necessarily toward conquering the world or getting rich, but because it was the most fun that you could have at that time. And so I'm just wondering, looking back, could your younger self have ever envisioned that all this would have happened, let alone that you'd be personally at the center of all of this? Is there any way, was this a grand strategy you had from 1993 onward, Andy? This is the chance to come clean if it was. And if not, how amazed are you at what's happened over the last 30 years?
Truthful answer, fuck yes. Yeah. And same for Mark and same for all of us. We set out to do this. We absolutely set out to do this. Could we have known the twists and turns? No. But I mean, when Mark and I stood at Sugarbush in 1995 and truly bonded as friends, we both had this vision that we wanted to make this scene our lives. We wanted to contribute to it. We wanted to enjoy the hell out of it. We saw the wave and we wanted to surf that wave, and we articulated it. We 100% believed the Biscuits could be everything they became. The Biscuits did not truly exceed our expectations, because our expectations were sky high. And for me, I'm very lucky. I didn't envision headcount. I didn't know what it would be. I mean, for me, it was at the beginning, it was a book about fish. It was the Farmer's Almanac. But I had every intention of making the most exciting and productive life for myself possible. And the Biscuits, fish, headcount, all of it, was my opportunity to live the life I wanted to live and to have a hell of a lot of fun. And so I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful that almost all of my friends are healthy. I'm, working on Divided Sky, really exposed to the pain that so many people have with the disease of addiction. And I'm very grateful that for the most part, my core friends, we've stayed healthy. We've taken care of each other. We have made good choices in life. I'm grateful to see so many of my friends have had wonderful kids and raised them well. And it's just like, hell yeah, man. Hell yeah. We set out to do this and we did it. And here we are in 2024, living a great chapter and not the last chapter. Because look at Phil Lesh, 84.
Yeah.
We got a lot of years ahead of us, I hope.
We definitely do. And Andy, I am grateful for you coming on the pod, and grateful for all of your contributions to the Disco Biscuits community, jam band culture writ large, and for everything that you and Headcount have done to encourage voter registration and democratic participation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Look forward to seeing you real soon.
All right, man. Thank you.
All right, to round us out, I thought I would bring back our friend Andy Bizzani from the Biscuits Internet Project to help us count down 5 of his favorite versions of Bernstein and Chasnoff. Andy, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you, Max. Happy to make my return.
Yes, it's been a minute, long overdue, but I can't think of a better excuse to have you on than to go deep into the history of one of the band's signature songs, a song that's been part of the repertoire since sometime in 1996, and part of what we'll talk about is when that song may have originally emerged. But that is, of course, the subject of this entire episode, Bernstein and Chasnoff. 237 recorded performances on the Biscuits Internet Project. I thought before we got into your list of 5 all-time versions, I might give you the opportunity to just reflect a little bit on Bernstein and Chasnoff, the place it has occupied in the repertoire, I guess, not only in the present, but historically over the course of the 29-ish years since the song first debuted.
Well, yeah, Max, I would really love to. The history of the songs is, of course, always something that I have found very interesting as a fan, and I love to trace the development of songs and how they're used. And Bernstein is a particularly interesting one because Bernstein is actually one of the earliest songs to get a trance jam. Bernstein has trance jams back in early 98, even before Basis for a Day, for example.
I did not know that.
Yeah, Basis doesn't start to get unsed out until April 98, and a very famous early version of Bernstein did not make my top 5, but definitely worth hearing, is March 21, 1998, which is the techno version of Bernstein. Bernstein's a big song in the 90s. It's a big song in the early 2000s, and it has a nice little golden age during Alan's tenure as well. It's produced some crazy deep jams at various points in the career.
One thing that I've always noticed about Bernstein's evolution is that the song contracted at a certain point in its history. You might know the exact dates. I place it somewhere around 2000-ish, where the final section of Bernstein and Chasnoff, which at some point back then I was told is called Smell the Funk, went from having multiple parts to being a much more compact part. But it is a tag on the song that, very much like the end of Jamelia or a lot of the songs from that back then, is very discordant with the rest of the song. You've got the upbeat, major key sing-songy lyrics followed by this very dark and dramatic and anthemic chant at the end. A sense of when the Smell the Funk section contracted? And correct me if I'm wrong, it came back at some point?
It had a bit of a Phoenix from the Ashes moment. If I were to speculate on why it has disappeared, I have no answer. It is definitely it is a triumphant BARBER section. If you listen to the old versions, I mean, he would rip that thing to shreds. He's that is not as much his style in the modern era, I guess. But it drops off pretty quickly, and it's sometime early 99. Because by the end of Winter Tour, they have shortened the ending. It's brought back for a singular performance in 2001 for whatever, just our luck. One of only very few shows from that year that have no recording.
And I'll take the blame for that. I recorded that.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, that was it.
Oh, I guess that was your tenure. Yeah.
That was at the Zephyr Club in Salt Lake City, Utah. And it was not a club that was accustomed to supporting tapers. And as a result, the tape got lost. But I do recall that show starting out with Helicopters, Smell the Funk. After the show, Mark told me to write the set list as Smell the Funk.
Okay, straight from the source then. It appeared in 2001, kind of maybe, and then makes its significant return. It actually coincides with what I refer to as the golden age of Bernstein with Alan, which is it comes back at 12/29/06. Another honorable mention, didn't crack the top 5, but definitely worth hearing set. And then I believe it's in every version from 07, and then in 08, they stopped playing it again.
Let's now turn our attention, Andy, to your top 5 most notable versions. And I feel bad limiting you to 5, but I want to, again, direct everyone back to the Biscuits Internet Project because there's quite a lengthy list of recommended all-time versions of Bernstein and Chasnoff that you've included here. So if the 5 picks that Andy shares with you today aren't enough, head back over to discobiscuits.net, click on the songs tab, do a search for Bernstein and Chasnoff, and you'll find a long list spanning from 98, that version, that early perfumey version from March 21st, all the way through a 2017 version at the Fillmore in Philly. So with that, Andy, why don't we kick things off? Is this in ranked order? Is this chronological? How did you do this?
I put it in chronological order. I think I would have a hard time ranking because there's a lot of variety within these picks. However, my first pick chronologically is also my number 1, Bernstein and Chasnoff.
Okay, what's that?
That would be 5/5/99. I believe the venue is called the Exit Inn. Are you going to fact check me on that?
I've got BIP open. So yes, it is at the Exit Inn, a legendary Nashville club where a lot of the 70s Nashville singer-songwriters came up. And this is a standalone first set version. What about this version, Andy, makes it so special that it tops your personal list?
In part, it is emblematic of everything they were doing right with the song in 99 and spring 99 especially, where they were taking this happy, poppy, exuberant, and blissful song and saying, all right, in the jam section, how evil can we make it? And this version is some of the most evil music produced by this band in any capacity. There's kind of a sense of slipping from something comfortable into something very dangerous. It sounds like no other Biscuits jam. interests me especially. It's got a prime example of one of the best parts of 1.0 Biscuits, which is when you hear BARBER, latch on to a really cool idea. Yeah. You hear that with like the chugging riff that he does, followed by those like piercing notes that are extremely unsettling. Listen to Sammy as BARBER's doing that. He's picking up on it really quickly, and it allows BARBER to completely lead the jam, to completely transform where it's going and completely shift the direction.
Well, before we move on from 1999, I'll throw out an honorable mention in the form of the September 11th, 1999 version. That, of course, being from Northampton, Massachusetts, known today, more familiar with fans as being an early instance of the band jamming on the Story of the World theme. Now, Andy, what's the next version that is on your list?
Chronologically, the next version is October 27th, 2000. It's somewhere in the Midwest.
I'm going to see if my memory's still good. Was that the Bluebird in Indiana?
Oh,
yes,
I think
it
you're
was.
Right. Yeah.
The Bloomington, Indiana Bluebird, and the Bernstein there came, again, a standalone version. Remember the days where there were standalone versions of songs of Biscuit shows? And no one complained because they were amazing jams. So this was the second to last song of the first set. Andy, what stands out about this version, which comes fairly early on in the Mark has returned to the Biscuits period, fall tour 2000?
I have a friend who refers to it as the makeup sex tour. And in many ways, fall 2000 is a picking up of where we left off. One of the things about fall 2000 is the increased prevalence of the breakbeat drumming, the drum and bass style, often more psychedelic and more experimental, cacophonous sometimes. This Bernstein has all of that. The breakdown in this jam, rather than, sinister musically, is almost like a controlled chaos.
Well, let's have a listen to that version from the Bluebird in Bloomington, Indiana. All right, Andy, next up on your list, we turn to what I understand at this point, and knowing you to be one of your favorite time periods in the band's career, the fall of 2001. What is the version that stood out for you from that period?
From 2001, there are a couple of really good ones to choose from, but I have always had a soft spot in my heart for 9601, Higher Ground. This is the first of my picks that is not a standalone. It is the B&C Sound 1 B&C sandwich. It's very different than the previous two entries because it does not scare you. It does not try to scare you. This is a much more mellow, much more peaceful, poppy and blissful kind of B&C. It serves to show kind of what's best about both that tour and the song. It's got, it's got a kind of steady trance theme. You've got all of those sounds that the band was using that are just emblematic of that time period. The distortion pedal that BARBER was using that kind of sounds like Jerry Garcia on Dancing in the Street from Barton Hall. It's a real beautiful piece. Very different from the first two.
Well, let's have a listen to September 6, 2001, Bernstein, Sound 1, Bernstein. So the next version on your list takes us up to what you consider to be the song's heyday, 2007. We just mentioned that this is the year when The Full Smell of the Funk comes back. We are in peak new Allen at this point. I know you are a big proponent of all things 2007. You are the one who turned me on to the joys of the May and October shows. I guess those spill into November as well. But what is it about this? Well, what is, first of all, the version that you selected from 2007? And what is it about that song and that year's sound that appeals to you so much?
What appeals about 07? It's the same stuff that appeals about 99. I really feel like that is Allen's 99. 07 is that great sparse minimalism. It's very psychedelic. And so the version of the song that I picked,
yes,
this came down to the wire. And I think I went with the more traditional, which is the day set of Camp Bisco, 8/16/07, the opener of the set. Mention would have been 10/16/07 at the Cannery Club, which is very underrated because there is no soundboard. Definitely worth checking out as well.
Let's move on now, Andy, to your last pick, number 5, the most recent version.
For the most recent version, and I would argue that this is the most recent great version of the song, we would go to 2317, the Fillmore in Philadelphia. You are probably thinking, dear listener, that this is a pity pick, gotta include one from the later years. I implore you to give this one a listen. This one is all about the minimalism, the atmosphere. This one is a masterpiece of ambient texturing. It's not particularly fist-pumping rager version, but it is a good introspective listen. Toss on your headphones and close your eyes and just let the music take you on a journey.
And this one opens the show, and it is a Bernstein, Voices Insane, Bernstein and Chasnoff sandwich. Andy, any versions that didn't make the list, but that you wish you had more room for?
Honestly, they didn't miss with that song in '99. They didn't miss. It's a tall order, of course.
Yeah.
But if you were to challenge every single Bernstein from '99, I think you would come away saying that was a good use of my time. Special versions, New Year's Eve '98, I believe, has a big, it's a weird one. So they do a Bernstein, they play the peak, and then they kind of jam out of that and do a big trance jam into the ending of Nughuffer.
Yes.
Very, very worth hearing for that early transfusion sound.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your unparalleled knowledge of the band's history and catalog with us. We'll have you on real soon the next time we do another one of these song spotlights.
Awesome, man. I can't wait. Have a good one.
We will leave it there. Thank you once again to the two Andys, Bernstein and Bazzani, for coming on to assist with this deep dive into the history of one of the band's most iconic songs, Bernstein and Chasnoff. Touchdowns All Day is an Osiris Media production. Check us out on the web at www.touchdownsallday.com. This episode was written, produced, and edited by me, Max Dawson. Mixing and mastering support, Matt Dwyer at Osiris Media. Barbara and I would love to hear from you. Please, if you've got feedback or a request for a topic for an upcoming episode, covers to share, 424-666-SIYD. That's the Touchdowns All Day hotline. You could also reach us at Barber Shreds and at FY Maxwell on all social platforms. And the show's account is at TDAD Baby on X and at Touchdowns All Day on Instagram. This and every episode of Touchdowns All Day would not be possible without the contributions of many women and men, including the Disco Biscuits road crew. That's Ben, Pat, Nick, Brian, Rich, Dane, Amin, Herm, and Tara Gracer, who provides us with our photos. Of course, the band itself, Mark, Aaron, John, and Alan. Ben Baruch and Andrew Kaplan at 1111 Management. The TDAD Advisory Committee, Andy Bazzani and Mike Walsh from the Biscuits Internet Project, Russ Tabes, Dave Cook, Scott McClintock, Rich Steele, and Ian Armstrong. Extra special thanks to Plan C archivist John Goldberg for supplying some of the historical recordings that played throughout this episode. Thanks to the coaches, Joey Friedman and Steve Martocci. And of course, extra special thanks to Lisa Gutwillig, Deb Brownstein, Angelica Magner, Sandra O'Quinn, Andrea Rivers, and Avery McMahon. On behalf of John Barber, Alex Mazer, and the entire Touchdowns All Day family, this is Max Dawson saying, see you next time.
We're mass communicating. We're mass communicating. We're mass communicating.
Osiris.